Hey guys, Chris from 6++ here, and welcome to our series Playing the Primary, which we focus on the objective and primary scoring aspect of 40k. Today we're going to be looking at mission 13, Data Scry-Salvage. We're going to look at the mission difficulty, we're going to look at what a projected primary score might look like, as well as anything specific to this particular mission. Let's crack on. Data Scry-Salvage is a 6 objective mission in a diagonal deployment. You score 4 points for holding 2 objectives, 4 points for holding 3, and of course 4 points for holding more than your opponent. The mission tertiary is based around doing an action on your home field objective with a unit, and then you score points for each objective you hold in no man's land at the end of your turn, up to a maximum of 3. One final key point is that this mission has sticky objectives. This means that if you hold an objective in no man's land with an obsec unit in your command phase, then you can walk off it and still hold it in your next turn. So, how easy is it to score on this mission? Well, let's get this out of the way first of all. This can be a very brutal mission, and I really wouldn't be surprised if in general this is the mission with the largest average score differential in the game. If you lose, you're probably going to lose big. This comes down to the fact that scoring primary in this mission is really tricky, as you have to hold 3 objectives, including 2 in no man's land, just to score your 8 points. Couple this with the fact that lots of terrain layouts will leave 1 objective out in the open on each side in no man's land, as seen on this UKTC terrain map, and suddenly it means we're going to find it hard to score well by consistently holding our objectives, and thus project our score with confidence. So before we analyse our projection, we need to talk through the fundamentals of how to approach this mission. So the most obvious point is that you do not want to be trying to make a play and hold all 4 of the objectives across the middle of the board. You're not going to be able to do it, you will almost certainly lose. So when you turn up to the table, look at the terrain and think, where can I deploy most of my forces, because I want to make the play on one half of the board. Okay, so obviously if you think of halves as having 2 objectives in no man's land on the left, 2 objectives in no man's land on the right, you want to be thinking which side do you want, and that's going to be terrain dependent. Where can you get around 70% of your force deployed and have access to those 2 objectives on one side or the other to try and hold? Now I say 70-30 because you still need to be able to interact with the objectives on the right hand side. You don't want to give your opponent an easy life. You're not necessarily worried about holding those objectives, but you're going to be there trying to be a nuisance, knock them off and that sort of thing. And so yeah, it's obviously it's army dependent, but I'd be saying kind of like a 70-30 split of putting your force on, a strong side where you can look to whip around that flank, and the weak side where you can just kind of be a nuisance. What you're also going to want to think about is how you're going to actually hold those objectives on your side of the board. Normally you can just stick stuff in the background and it'll be safe. These units are going to be getting involved. So one potential way you could go about doing this is have the main focus of your force on that middle objective of the side. So let's say if you pick the left hand side, that middle-ish objective, that's where all the action is going to be happening, that's where you're focusing your attention. Turn 1, you can stick an obsec unit on that far side along with some other bits. Hopefully they don't get killed. You then hold that objective. You can then move off that objective from turn 2 really, but you'll still be scoring a primary on it. They can then be useful to kind of push forward into your enemy's deployment zone. So that's a potential way. Obviously if you don't want to be engaging in combat, then actually that's maybe something you don't want to do. You might want to flip the kind of the situation. So it's something to think about, but yeah, you're going to be having to put usual objective holding units out there in no man's land, so you want to think about how to space them across those 2 objectives. So in terms of looking at a general projection, this is going to be a really hard one to try and work out. I would say if you go first, especially, you could be looking for an 8 on your second turn, because they've only got 1 turn to try and get across and knock you off your 2 objectives if they choose to. The likelihood, most games go this way, 1 person focuses on one side, 1 person focuses on the other. So yeah, let's say we go first, we could probably get an 8. From then on though, 8s are going to be hard. Be happy with a 4. 0s are more than likely to happen at least once in this game. So yeah, try not to worry. The important thing is that you're making sure you're doing that to your opponent as well. And then, hey, it doesn't matter if you're scoring a 4 and 8 because your opponents are also scoring 4s and 8s too. At some point, this game will just flip. Generally around turn 3, maybe turn 4. One flank will collapse for one player, and that will pretty much be game, because as long as secondaries are relatively even, which quite often they are, actually this game will just be by whoever cracks first in terms of losing too many resources and then just capitulates because they can't hold primary anymore. Their opponent's now consistently scoring an 8 or even a 12, and the other opponent is scoring a 0 or a 4 if they're lucky. And that's unfortunately how it goes, and that's where that differential comes from. So in terms of holding more, again, it's really hard to call because, you know, the mission can fluctuate so much. The most important thing I can say is you need to be paying attention to your opponent's primary scoring. You know, there are a lot of missions out there where you can just, both players just go about their business. You can't really interact with their primary in the grand scheme of things, or it can be quite hard anyway, and you just both score 40 plus. This is not that mission. So if your opponent is gaining a really strong foothold on the primary game, that will probably win them the match. So you need to be thinking about how are they going to be affecting your primary. You know, where are their movements going? Their units going? So where can they move to? What angles can they get? What objectives can they threaten? When you make a move, especially if you've got a tenuous link or grasp on an objective, what are they going to be able to put in line of sight to shoot off or even charge next turn? So yeah, unlike a lot of other missions, you really need to be paying attention to what they are doing with their primary. So of course that means you want to be paying attention on how you can knock them off. At the start of each of your turns, look at their objectives. Are there any weak links there? Can you knock them down 4 or even 8 points? Because that'll go a long way. In terms of tertiary, if you're going to be in this game, you're going to be scoring at least 2 points a turn. You're going to hopefully be holding your side of the board, those 2 objectives in no man's land that you've picked. So hopefully you're going to be able to score your tertiary for 2 on there. As the game goes on towards the end, you might, if you're in the ascendancy, you'll be able to score the 3s. Conversely, at the very beginning of the game, it might well be that you go first and you could score that 3 there. That's a decision you need to make. If you focused on one side of the board, so let's say, for example, I played Genestealer Cult once, and my Harlequins took the left side of the board, and then I stuck 2 bikes on the right side of the board, just on that objective, just to score me that extra point. That's definitely not the right thing to do. That scored me 1 primary point, and that was actually a very useful resource that I gave away for 1 primary point. So you will need to make those decisions. It might well be that actually you think maybe me putting this unit here is worth the 1 point, but generally be happy with your 2, because I think more than many other missions, this just comes down to trying to kill your opponent and smash down the flank and make the most of your resources, rather than just focusing on the pure maths of the scoring. So yeah, again, that's my thoughts on it anyway. One other thing to note in terms of hold more is we often talk about how if you go second, you could grab a hold more on battle round 5, and that might turn your 42 into a 45, for example. On this mission, a hold more is massive. So if you have got bottom of turn, if you're going second, you have to make sure that you've got the potential to score that 12, that hold more. Because if we think that there's every possibility, if both armies are heavy hitting, you're only scoring 4s on your primary, you could quite easily get to turn 4 and you could be on like 20 points on your primary. Then to score an extra 12 on that is a huge percentage increase. So yeah, if you've got bottom of turn, you really need to be thinking, especially as you hit turn 3 and 4, how am I going to be able to impact the objectives on this board so that I definitely score my 12, because that could well be the swing that wins you the game. One final note on this mission, the specific aspect of sticky objectives. something to try and bear in mind at all times. But if you have forward deploying units, if you have pre-game moves, like large pre-game moves, with OBSEC units, you can make those if you've got first turn, well, even if you've got second, but mainly if you've got first turn, you can move on to those objectives. You could deploy on those edge objectives. Then you've got that objective at the start of your command phase for turn 1. You then move off that objective, you now hold it. Okay, so it's it's obviously army dependent, but it is something to consider. Is there a way you could deploy a unit onto an objective, hold it, and then move off it, but still be holding it? Yeah, maybe something that could win you one game every so often. So what's our overall projection looking like? Well, you can probably tell it's going to be quite hard to work out. But I think as long as you can stick to one side of the board and you can hold down those 8s, you're probably looking to be scoring in the low 30s, as long as the game is reasonably close. Now, as I said before, this game quite often won't be close, but if it is reasonably close, then I think a low 30s is kind of like your traditional score, a mix of 4s and 8s, and scoring your tertiary objective. So yeah, you can see it's not going to be a high scoring game, but the thing is, that's the average. That's if both of you are doing roughly the same thing. The likelihood is that kind of 60, 70 score on primary will probably more like be a 50 to a 20, like a 45 to a 20, or a 25, based on whoever manages to push around and have them more units left towards the end of the game. So yeah, that's a rough projection. I know it's not great, but it's a tough mission. So finally, are there any exceptions or things we need to note with this mission? Well, Necrons really like this mission. They like to pre-game move, hold the objectives, and then say, go on, kill me. And by the time you've done that, you've run out of time and you've lost the game purely on the primary. They are very strong on this mission because obviously also they can just be really cheeky and just keep stealing away your objectives with all their OBSEC. So yeah, that's definitely something to be aware of. If you're facing Necrons on this mission, it could be a uphill struggle. There are, of course, a lot of objectives on this mission as well. So armies that like to pick secondaries that involve them doing actions on objectives, they'll enjoy this. Your Grey Knights. Can't think of any others right now, but there are lots of armies out there who like to rely on raised banners and that sort of thing. Those armies are going to enjoy this mission because they've got easy access to a lot of objectives to kind of get to do that. And finally, Elves. Tom made sure I mentioned Elves. Elves love giving the enemy 0 and 4s on these sorts of missions. So yeah, that's something to be aware of. They are going to be really quick and they're going to be getting all over the board and they're going to be trying to take you off your objectives and just beat you on the primary and pull over such a huge lead that you're not going to be able to catch up on the secondary. So yeah, that's also something to be mindful of. Armies with fast moving units could be tricksy. So there we go, Data Scry-Salvage. I'm kind of hoping this is the hardest mission to talk about. I think it probably is. There are just so many unknowns. I know when I turn up to the table, I was a bit worried about this mission. But hopefully it's been useful to you and offered you a bit of insight into how you can go about focusing on this mission when playing the primary. We're on our road to LGT at the time of recording, so we're working through those missions. We've done Abandoned Sanctuaries, we've now done Data Scry-Salvage. Next up is Death and Zeal, so that'll be our next one. As always, thank you for joining. We've received lots of positive feedback about these videos. We're all over the internet. If you check the link in the description, you'll see our link tree. We have an active Facebook page where we share lots of information, our tournament reports, lots of updates, all those sorts of things. We have an Instagram page where we share our painting. We have a podcast which you can see in video form or listen to on iTunes and stuff. So yeah, check us out and thank you for watching. Take care.